Well, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I've been in Canada quite a number of times before, and it's good to be back again. As Brian has said, it's Alex's first time. We have worked together as colleagues for a number of years, and we want to try and share the session together this evening. Alex is going to be the storyteller. So every so often she will pop up, and I hope be able to use that microphone. It's just a cue to the person operating the sound system. And we'll try to illustrate with some stories some of the things that we want to share this evening. In fact, both of us have a tendency to speak rather fast. And I know this is being translated, and so I'm consciously trying to slow down, because otherwise translators struggle. I was speaking at a Mennonite event in Switzerland a few years ago, and somebody who was translating suddenly rushed out from the back and went, "Slow down." So I'm not sure where the translators are, but if I go too fast, over there, okay, let me know and I will try and slow down. Finding God in our neighbourhood. Actually, the title I was given when I was first invited, I think, was, "Where is God in my neighbourhood?" It's a question. And so let's think a bit about some possible answers to that this evening. The text behind me is one of the most popular texts in early Anabaptist writings. Again and again, the early Anabaptist missionaries said, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." And they used that as a way of saying to the authorities who wanted to banish them from their territories, "We will not, we dare not promise never to return. This territory is not yours. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." They use this text to say to those who accuse them of being unauthorized preachers, "We can go anywhere. We are not bound by your parish boundaries. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." And you've chosen for this gathering a fairly similar text. You are not seeing it. Is it possible to operate it from the back? Thank you. "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples made by human hands." This New Testament text affirms what we read in Psalm 24. The whole earth belongs to God. Everything in it belongs to God. God is not restricted by human boundaries, human constructions, human institutions, temples built by human hands. Next slide, please. Of course, it doesn't mean simply to affirm that. We need to ask, what are the implications of that? We can affirm this very clearly. We can know that verse, we can sing that verse, we can declare that verse, but do we actually believe it? That the earth is the Lord's and that God is not confined to temples built by human hands. One of the problems we face is the language we sometimes use. When we call our church buildings churches. Yes, I know it's shorthand, but of course we know the building isn't the church, is it? We're not in a church building tonight, but we are still church. But to call our church buildings churches, even if we sort of know that it's only a shorthand, I just wonder whether that's problematic for us. And then to call the part of our church buildings where we worship sanctuaries exacerbates the problem. It seems that some places are more holy, more sacred than others. So we may accept in theory that God is not confined to our church buildings, but perhaps we suspect that he's especially present there. Perhaps that's where we think God particularly likes to hang out, in our church buildings, in our sanctuaries. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the mission activities of many churches seem to concentrate on attracting people into our special places. Come to church. Come into our buildings. Come to our programs. Come to the events that we will organize for you. God is here in our place. Come and find God where we are. Come to us. And part of that, I think, is simply the legacy of Christendom. As Alex and I have been travelling over the past week or two, we've talked quite a bit with a variety of people about the gradual transition in Western culture from what historians have called Christendom to what many are now describing as post-Christendom. And in Christendom, the church was at the centre of culture. Church buildings were familiar, people were used to going into them, coming to church, going to church. That sort of language was very familiar. And within the Christendom world, churches in many ways acted as chaplains to society. Church-going was common. It was never universal, but it was certainly common. So part of the Christendom legacy is we expect that church will be familiar to people, that church buildings will be accessible, that if people have spiritual interests, they might think of going to their local church. That's Christendom thinking. And there are still parts of Western culture where that may still be true. But as Christendom fades, it's going to become less true. In many places, that assumption, that expectation no longer holds. In many contexts, church buildings are entirely unfamiliar, in fact, quite scary places. People don't know what goes on in church buildings. Not only in the ancient church buildings that we have all over Britain, but even in the newer buildings in North America. They're just unfamiliar places. And so this come to us approach to mission is becoming obsolete. It's what we prefer. It's much easier to have people on our territory, our agenda, our times, our place, but actually it's not working. And it's not going to work in the future. And so we need to think about a change, I think, of strategy, of approach, of our understanding. Instead of come to us, it's going to be go to them. It's going to be a reverse of the direction. Next slide, please. So then, if God doesn't dwell, at least not exclusively in our buildings, in our temples, in our sanctuaries, where does God dwell? Where is God in our neighbourhood? That was the question you asked. And I wonder what your answer would be. If we were to stop now, and I'm very tempted to, but probably time is against us, and invite you to have conversations around your table, I wonder what answers you would come up with. Next slide, please. Well, we don't need to get rid of the idea of temple altogether. It's just that the New Testament changes our understanding of temple. It's no longer temples built by human hands, physical structures, church buildings. According to 1 Corinthians 3 verse 9, it's now mobile temples. Paul tells the Corinthians, you are God's building. Temples on the move. You are the church. So, first of all, where is God in the neighbourhood? Us. You and me, our brothers and sisters, as we are in the neighbourhood, we are the church. Church is not something that just happens when we're together in special buildings. We are still church when we are outside the buildings. We are still members of the body of Christ in our homes, in our workplaces, in our leisure activities, supporting our favourite football team, or wherever. We are the temple of God. Alex has a story for us that just says something about the possibilities when we understand ourselves to be mobile temples, out in the neighbourhood, looking for opportunities to see what God might do. Next slide, please.
Oh, I was going to do that bit. My story is a story of a retired Baptist minister called Jane. And she moved into a government housing estate in Bristol, which is the city that Stuart lives in. And when she arrived in her neighborhood, she prayed a very dangerous prayer. She said, God, show me the hardest people in this community to engage with, the most difficult, the ones that nobody else can reach. Well, she quickly realized that the house that she actually had chosen to move into was right in an area that two gangs sort of met and squared off oftentimes at night when it was dark. So one time she was inside her house and she noticed that the gang members were starting to sort of arrive outside, and she had just finished some baking, so she decided to pull her cakes out the oven and go outside and offer the gang members some cakes, because it's very difficult to fight when you're stuffing your mouth full of cupcakes. So time went on, and Jane got to know many of the gang members. She encouraged and helped many of them into education or into employment. One day, the police knocked on her door, and they asked, "Are you the cake lady?" She said, "Yes." And they said, "We don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is, just keep doing it, because crime in this area is down by 75%. More time went on, and one night a number of the gang members were in our house for dinner. The night wore on, and a number of people went home, but one young man asked her, "Jane, please can I stay here tonight? Please can I sleep on your sofa?" She wasn't entirely sure about this, whether she should go with that idea or not, but she had known him for some time, so she decided it was a risk to take. In the morning, this young man said to her, "That is the first time I've slept the whole way through the night. There is no evil here."
There is no evil here. Isn't that profound? Jane is just over 5 foot tall. She is therefore quite small. She doesn't present a threat of any kind. She was able to be what these gang members needed in an unthreatening and welcoming way. It required courage, it required creativity, and it required her to be out there in the neighbourhood, watching what was happening and listening to what God might be saying to her. One of the things that suggests to us then is that if we are to be serious about discovering where God might be in the neighbourhood, and if we are, in a sense, part of the answer to that question, we need to be out in the neighbourhood. We need to be out beyond the walls of our churches. One of the struggles that we find in many of our British churches is that church programs can become so busy, so demanding, that it's difficult to find time to be outside the church, to be involved in the neighbourhood, building relationships, watching, listening, spotting opportunities to be good news. One of the things that we encourage people to do in these churches is to make sure they spend at least a significant amount of time regularly beyond the walls of the church. If God is not confined to these temples made of human hands, nor should we be. It may be that many of our churches are simply too busy, still trying to maintain a program of activities that was perhaps appropriate in a Christendom age, but in post-Christendom is wearing us out and is hindering us from being good news in our communities. Living out the good news and also speaking out the good news. It's probably that second part that is less congenial in Mennonite circles. As I've met Mennonites over quite a number of years now, I have deeply appreciated the emphasis on living the gospel, living authentically, living distinctively, living faithfully, with the assumption, I think, that that will be witness. People will see lives that are distinctive, lives that are attractive, lives that are shaped by a different story, and will be drawn to that story and to Jesus, who is at the center of that story. The difficulty we have in post-Christendom, in this emerging culture, is that those around us less and less have the tools to interpret the way any of us live. That we need to interpret, that we need to speak as well as act. And that may not come quite so naturally to those within the Mennonite tradition. But things may be changing. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been involved in a number of pastor clusters in different parts of Canada, in all the provinces heading to the west and back again. And in each of those situations, we have invited the pastors in advance to consider 7 possible topics for conversation. I sent those out beforehand, and I threw in, almost as a last-minute suggestion, rehabilitating evangelism. And I sort of thought, well, I don't think Mennonites will want to talk about that. There are many other subjects on the list that probably will come first. I need to report to you that 6 out of the 7 clusters identified rehabilitating evangelism as the thing they wanted to talk about. We have spent several hours in that conversation over the last couple of weeks. It seems that something is afoot, something stirring. Of course, we don't like some of the old ways of evangelizing. We don't want to be associated with the tele-evangelists. We don't want some of the programmatic activities that just seem so manipulative. We want to find an authentically Anabaptist approach to evangelism. And so rehabilitating evangelism is going to be a journey. We're going to need to clear some of the ground in terms of what that word means, the wretched E word. But perhaps we can move beyond that to find a way of speaking out as well as living out the good news that is authentic to who we are. So, first of all, where does God live in the neighbourhood? Well, in us, if we're prepared to be in the neighbourhood, if we're prepared to live faithfully, distinctively, creatively, courageously, and to speak out as well, to explain the story that has shaped our lives. But where else does God live in the neighbourhood? Is it just there? Is it only in the followers of Jesus? That was the assumption of a previous generation of church planters. Alex and I have been with a number of church planters here this afternoon. We're both involved in church planting. I've been working with church planters for over 30 years. And the assumption of a previous generation of church planters was that they were bringing God with them into the neighbourhood. That God wasn't there before they arrived. It's as if they had God in their back pocket and suddenly could present God in the neighbourhood. I never heard a church planter actually saying that, but you sort of felt that's what they thought was going on. Something's changed. I don't find church planters coming with that attitude at all now. There's a growing sense, of course, God is already there in the neighbourhood. God has gone ahead of us. And our task as pioneers, as church planters, is to find out what God is doing and join in. God is there already. And part of finding out what God is already doing seems to be trying to identify those who wittingly or unwittingly are already in the flow of what God is doing. Next slide, please. And many church planters are particularly drawn to this passage in Luke 10, where Jesus sends out the 72, and to a phrase associated with that passage, a person of peace. Find the person of peace in the community. Many church planters spend quite a bit of their time in the early months looking for persons of peace, persons of goodwill, persons who in some way seek the good, the shalom of the community. Alex has another story about this. Next slide, please.
This is a picture of some of my friends and some of my neighbours from the East End of London. And this lunch arose after a long time of building relationships. In 2014, 2015, there were 4 Bengali teenage girls who went to Syria to try and join ISIS. And for us in our church and the Christian community and the Muslim community as well, there was such a great feeling of misunderstanding and grief that 4 girls who had grown up in the UK would want to go and make those choices. So in our church, which is a Baptist church, and in 2 local Anglican churches, we realized that we really needed to spend some time together and to build community. Our people needed to build community with each other because the leaders knew each other, but actually ordinary Muslims and ordinary Christians didn't know each other, even though they probably lived next to each other and went to school together and passed each other on the street. So we knocked around a few ideas and, we're sort of thinking about what was going to be a good thing to do. How are we going to get each other into our communities? And we decided to come up with a very British thing, and that we would have Sunday lunch together. So the first thing that we would do is that the Christians in two churches, my church and a local Anglican church, would go to the mosque, and we would be hosted by them. They would do all the cooking. I think we brought the cakes, but everything would be done by them. For a lot of people in our communities, they had never spoken to someone who was Muslim. My neighborhood was 60% Muslim. So for someone not to ever have spoken to someone who was a Muslim was, quite an achievement, really. But this had been accomplished. And so, yes, we convinced our small church, who were very nervous and very fearful about going to a mosque, that actually it was going to be okay. We were going to eat food together and try and have conversations about what it was to be good neighbors, for us to know each other, for us to be able to seek these people of peace, as Stuart said. And the first one was a great success, and everyone was surprised. Nothing terrible happened. Muslims are good people. This was a shock. But we started to build relationships, we started to build friendships, and then people started saying hi in the street to each other. We started to recognize each other. And then we returned the favor, and I was part of a very small little church. The Anglicans have all the money, so we went to their big church, and they put an amazing spread for us. And our Muslim brothers and sisters came. We were really nervous. We didn't know what was going to happen. Will they come into the church? Will they be afraid, just as we were afraid? But actually, they came in. We sat together. That guy in the front, you can see with the grey hair, with a sort of red and white top, he is a hardened Northern Irishman. And you don't mess with him. But he was the one who was talking to a young Muslim man and breaking bread and having conversation. And just in that moment, when I took that photo, I just thought, this is a sparkle of the kingdom of God. This is what it looks like when people eat together, when people drink together, and when they start to build community together.
So a second answer to the question, where might God be in our neighbourhood? Well, maybe God is at work already through others who are not part of the Christian community. Maybe God is at work through Muslims, through Hindus, through Sikhs, through secularists, through atheists, through nominal Christians. Maybe God is at work in unexpected places and surprising ways. And none of this means that we fall into some kind of wishy-washy syncretism. It doesn't mean that there are no differences between those different communities. It doesn't mean that we don't want to share the good news of Jesus Christ with those around us. But it means that we're open to seeing what God might be doing through people who are outside the community of faith. And actually, if you look through the scriptures, you find that is not unusual. There are quite a number of examples of people in both Old and New Testament through whom and in whom God appears already to be at work. Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, who saves Moses from burnout. Do you remember that? Moses is wearing himself out, trying to judge all the cases that are brought to him. And Jethro, his father-in-law, not part of the covenant people, comes to him and says, in no uncertain terms, Moses, stop being so stupid. You're wearing yourself out. Delegate, man. Cyrus the king, who unwittingly walks straight into God's purposes. Cornelius in the New Testament, one of my favorite encounters. Acts 10, and then Acts 11, where Peter has to go back and try to explain to the church what on earth's been going on. Cornelius, not just a Gentile, but a full-blown, pork-eating, uncircumcised Gentile, a Roman centurion, the enemy. Peter is in his house. The evangelist has an opportunity to preach the good news to this soldier. And the very first thing he says is, "Ah, now I get it," which is not the best way of starting an evangelistic sermon. Now I get it. God responds to anybody from any background who genuinely seeks after him. An angel had spoken to Cornelius and told him to find Simon Peter. And Peter had heard from God through a vision that he was to go to Cornelius' house. I'm not sure who was the most surprised. But Peter finds that God's already at work before he gets there. There's a double conversion going on in the house of Cornelius. Cornelius certainly, but Peter also discovers that God's purposes are much, much greater than he'd ever realized. Alex has two more stories about God at work, perhaps through surprising people. God at work beyond the community. We need another slide.
Is that on? Oh, it is on. This is a story that was told to Stuart and I by our colleague Juliet. And I think, as Juliet has travelled with Stuart before, some of you might have met her. Juliet has become increasingly involved and concerned about the refugee crisis that is happening, and centred particularly in Calais, which is a town on sort of the edge of France, right before the sea. Migrants are making their way across Europe and seeking refuge in Germany and France sometimes, but ultimately some people have friends and family in the UK that they're trying to reach. And I think this really started in the summer last year because of the number of people who are trying to make their way across Europe. Juliet started taking some things, some provisions, and it sort of culminated into a role of listening and being present with people and trying to understand people's stories. She told us a story about a man from Sudan, and he's a refugee. He sort of gathers things into his shelter that will be useful for the rest of the community. He's sort of a community organizer in the camp. But each day he just gets whatever is donated to him. So sometimes there might be food provisions, sometimes there might be shoes, sometimes there might be soap and toiletries. And the camp is very, very muddy. I visited with Juliet in November, and just the amount of mud and dirt there is just unbelievable. So shoes are something that people go through really, really quickly. A man from Afghanistan came to this Sudanese man's shelter and said, "Shoes, I need shoes." The Sudanese man said, "I'm sorry, brother, I don't have any shoes today." The man from Afghanistan said again, "Please, I need shoes." Again, the Sudanese man said, "I'm sorry, I have clothes, but I have no shoes." A third time, the man from Afghanistan said, "Brother, please, I need shoes." And at that point, the man from Sudan took off his own shoes and gave them to his brother from Afghanistan. Does that sound familiar? Any other stories that you can think of? Does it echo at all? My next story, if I could have the next slide, is another story about food. We seem to have a lot of stories about food in Urban Expression. And this is a story of a couple called Phil and Christine. They're rather disparagingly described by my colleague as the most unlikely looking church planters. But when he said that in a group of church planters from Urban Expression, everybody nodded. And I laughed, because they do look very unlikely. In Urban Expression, we have a lot of church planters who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s. And Phil and Christine, I guess, are in their mid-50s. Is that about right? Yeah. They're both very tall and very grey-haired and quite softly spoken. This is a great story from them because it's completely unexpected. And I like that God surprises us. They are an Urban Expression team in a town in the West Midlands called Wolverhampton. In September of 2015, they were approached by a Hindu couple who they knew from trying to get to know the community that they're part of. And this couple said, "We would really like to put on a lunch event at Christmas, on Christmas Day, for people who are going to be lonely or isolated or who are vulnerable in some way." Phil and Christine are one of our only Urban Expression teams that actually have access to a building. So that was why the Hindu couple thought of asking them. And Phil and Kristen were really excited about this because they thought, yeah, great idea, let's do that. So plans began to sort of get into formation, and the Hindu couple said, oh, also, we know someone who is a chef in one of Jamie Oliver's restaurants. Do you know who, I'm guessing you know who Jamie Oliver is, right? Yes, okay. So he's a cheeky chappy. Yes, he's a chef in one of his restaurants, and he's going to come and cook for you. And this guy said, yes, I'm really excited about this. So things went on, and there were some hitches, there were some problems. The Hindu couple came to Phil and Christian and said, you must pray to your God to help us to sort these things out. It's very interesting. Things continued to develop, and a Sikh organizer got in touch with them and said, yes, I work in the Sheraton, and I would like to decorate the church for you. I would like to do everything as beautifully as it can be done for these people who are coming. And as you can see, it looks like a wedding. Our church buildings do not look like that normally. On the day, there were more than 50 volunteers from different organizations and networks that Phil and Christine had got to know, and about 100 people who would have been alone or homeless or in other ways isolated on Christmas Day. There was a children's entertainer, they had prizes, and the Hindu couple also said, please, will you give a message about your God on that day? So a Hindu couple and a Sikh and a Christian and a whole bunch of volunteers from all different faith backgrounds put in an amazing event on Christmas Day and talked about Jesus. Hallelujah.
So maybe part of finding God in our neighbourhoods is forming partnerships with unlikely people. Maybe it's not just about us. Maybe it's also about finding those through whom, wittingly or unwittingly, God is at work, sharing good news, bringing shalom, peace, justice, and community to our neighbourhoods. Next slide, please. Which means, I think, that one of the shifts that we may need to make is from gathered mission to dispersed mission, which is really another way of saying what I was saying earlier about moving from come to us to go to them. It's a sporting analogy that's sometimes used. So whatever your favourite sport is, whether it's what we call football and you call soccer, whether it's hockey, whether it's curling, whatever it is, there's a difference between playing at home and playing away. It is much easier to play at home. You have the crowd on your side. You have knowledge of the facilities. You know where the bumps in the pitch are. You know where all the facilities are. The atmosphere is in your favour. When you go away from home, it's quite different, and the atmosphere can be quite hostile. It's not surprising that, by and large, home teams do better than away teams. Well, transferring that to the mission context, we have been playing at home for centuries. Come to us. Our buildings, our agenda, our programs. Brothers and sisters, it may be time to play away. To go to where people are, to go to where they feel comfortable, even if we feel a bit uncomfortable. Quite simply, we need to get out more. Beyond our church buildings, beyond the comfort zones, to where we might find God at work in unlikely places. Where is God in the neighbourhood? Well, with us, if we go, with others who might be there already, if we're open to the surprises and the possibilities. Final slide. What then about church meetings and church buildings? If God doesn't live in these temples built by human hands, what is their role? Well, we do still need to gather. We need one another, and we will need each other even more in a post-Christendom world, where there are far fewer supports for faith and discipleship in the surrounding culture. We will need to worship a missionary God. We will need to tell the big story of God's love for the whole of creation. We will need to be shaped by that story. We will need to out-narrate our culture and tell a better story. We will need also to report back on what we see God doing in the neighbourhood. We need to recover, I think, the ancient practice of testimony. Some people think that testimony is only about what happened 30 years ago when I first met Jesus. It's not. Testimony is about sharing the good news of what God is doing today, where we've seen God at work in our community, in our neighbourhoods. We need to make time for that, testifying to where we have seen God at work. But though we need to meet, we may not need to meet quite as often. We may need to free up some time to find out what God is doing in the neighbourhood, to follow what God is doing there. And we may need to be more intentional about what we do when we meet together. What is it that will really nurture us as countercultural disciples? What is it that will energize us to be effective missionaries in our culture? It's one of the questions that we've been looking at a bit in the pastoral clusters over the last couple of weeks. And I have dared to pose what I think is probably a Mennonite heresy. So I'll risk it again tonight. We're flying home tomorrow, so we'll be out of your hair fairly soon. So forgive us if this is deeply offensive. I'm just wondering whether a sermon and a few songs is the most effective way of using our time together. I know we do a few other things. There's the notices, there's the offering, there's a bit of sharing of news and prayer, but a lot of the time we spend together is spent listening to a sermon and singing lots of songs. Now, I have to confess to a personal bias here, and it's one that Alex doesn't share. We've been talking about this as we travelled. I don't particularly find singing conducive. I know that's heresy. I'm really sorry about this. I'm just being honest. One hymn a month would be adequate for me. Yep. I know. Okay, I've said it. It's out there now. Whereas I could hear Alex singing with great vigour beside me this evening. She's been looking forward to singing with you this evening. And Mennonites sing really well. But I just wonder whether we might want to rethink our priorities, the intentionality of what we do when we meet together. What is it that will nurture us as countercultural disciples? What is it that will inspire us to be missionaries all over the place in our neighbourhoods, not just trying to bring people into our meetings? And the pastoral clusters, we've thrown out some suggestions. I haven't got time for that this evening, but perhaps an open question. What do we do when we meet together? How intentional are we about forming missional disciples? And finally, what about our buildings? How radically and how creatively are we prepared to think about our temples? I wonder sometimes whether we put on extensive programs to justify the amount of money we've spent on our buildings. We've invested in them so much, well, we've got to use them for something. And it's okay to invite the community around to use them as well, but I wonder whether sometimes our busyness is actually driven by the buildings, whether the buildings themselves have begun to take precedence. Are they actually hindering our participation in God's mission? Do we actually need our buildings at all? And if that sounds like a ridiculous suggestion, then I wonder if we're touching on idolatry. What hold do our buildings have on us? How radically are we prepared to think about them? If God doesn't dwell in these sacred places in a special sort of way, well, are they helpful? Are they a hindrance? Dare we ask those sorts of questions? The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, said the early Anabaptists, most of whom did not have sacred buildings, and were quite wary of the whole notion of sacred places and sacred buildings. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples made by human hands. Do we believe that? How are we demonstrating that belief? May I pray with you? God, thank you that you do not confine yourself to our boundaries, to the boundaries of our buildings and to the boundaries of our imagination. We pray for the courage and the faith to follow you wherever you lead us. To be good news, to share good news, to find those through whom you are working, to find unexpected partners, to be where you want us to be. In Jesus' name.